I'm Jeremy Fackenthal. I'm a recent graduate of Claremont Graduate University, where I studied process thought, and then slowly came to this weird thing called critical theory in the Frankfurt School. Um, and tonight I'm actually going to do something that might seem rather odd. I'm going to talk about critical theory, which is often critiqued itself for not having anything practical to say to the real concerns of the 99%. But I think that there are things in critical theory that do have practical implications, and I'm going to point out one of those that I think is capable of bridging the gap between theory and praxis. Um, and before I do that, John Cobb recently has written quite a bit on empire and Christianity, and he's pointed out, similar to what Jorg was saying earlier, that as Christians, as people of faith, our faith should motivate us to look outward. So rather than cultivating an inward faith in which we focus on piety and ourselves, our faith encourages us and even demands us to look outward beyond ourselves. And this can take many forms. And I love what John says about this. But what I want to do tonight is to add another sort of vertical dimension to this piece. Because I think that we can all too often, and I certainly, as even a poor graduate student, have a certain amount of privilege in the fact that I've been able to sit around and read books and think about things and write papers for 5 years, which may not be terribly well connected to the real world. And so all of us in the church have a certain amount of privilege, and this oftentimes encourages us to do things like charity. And so an outward act of our faith may be some type of charity, and there's certainly nothing wrong with this. However, it, as Jorg was pointing out, doesn't always totally address the systemic oppression that requires some sort of structural change and what I call an inverted or changed perspective. So what I want to talk about for a few minutes are two critical theorists, Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin, who wrote and lived in Germany. Benjamin himself was actually Jewish. He became a literary theorist, wrote books and essays on classical literature. Adorno was one of the early members of what became known as the Frankfurt School, which is sort of the mecca, if you will, or foundation of critical theory in Germany. Adorno himself was part Jewish and part Christian as well. And these individuals certainly wouldn't have called themselves theologians, though I think they did end up having something to offer to theology. And interestingly, Benjamin in 1934 wrote an essay on the writings of Franz Kafka, who was a German writer who wrote about very abstract, strange conditions. And Benjamin's essay was picked up by Adorno, and by this time they'd become friends and corresponded frequently. Adorno read this essay and he just fell in love with it. So he wrote a letter to Benjamin in which he explained what he saw Benjamin doing with Kafka. And he said, "I claimed he represents a photograph of our earthly life from the perspective of a redeemed life, one which merely reveals the latter as an edge of black cloth, whereas the terrifyingly distanced optics of the photographic image is none other than that of the obliquely angled camera himself." So this is a very abstract sentence in itself, but he goes on to describe this sentence and this position as inverse theology. And he says that he and Benjamin both sort of claim this theology and embody it in their writing and thought. So to unpack this a little bit, this largely sort of enigmatic description of inverse theology means that the perspective has been switched or inverted. And so now we're no longer taking on this sort of inward and upward looking faith, but it demands us to have not only an outward, but also a downward-looking faith. So we assume the perspective of the redeemed. So that's not to say that we're claiming divinity or anything like that for ourselves, but we're looking at the world and at what Adorno called damaged life, or the harsh reality of material existence from a very different perspective. And this altered perspective requires something of us, because if we're looking at it from a redeemed perspective, we know that the harsh conditions of reality are not the conditions that should in fact exist in reality. And we know that there are alternative possibilities for reality. And not only that, but there isn't, if we take on this perspective, there isn't any sense in which we can ignore the concerns of the 99%. There's no sense in which we can ignore the systemic economic injustice present in the world. So Benjamin goes on in some later writings just before his death, called Theses on the Philosophy of History, to talk about what I think is his own version of inverse theology. And he says that humanity is endowed with a weak messianic power. So he thinks that humans can be real agents on God's behalf in the world. And whenever Benjamin talks about the messianic, what he really intends is a notion of redemption that is certainly not a Christian form of redemption, since he was Jewish, but it's a redemption in which we are required to remember the sufferings of the past. And so we as human beings together can collectively use this weak messianic power in order to bring about a real redemption in the world by refusing to forget, refusing to let go of the suffering of what he calls damaged life. So by addressing these issues face on, rather than letting them slip into the past, this is a very earthly and present form of redemption that Benjamin advocates. And so I think what this critical theory, in fact, does is bridge the gap between theory and practice, in that it provides us with a lens, a new lens through which to work or to look, which Adorno calls this obliquely angled camera. It's kind of askew, and maybe we don't get a real clear image of the world because we can't see the world for what it should be, but we actually, in fact, now see conditions as they are, as oppressed, as suffering, and it requires us to act. So if we take on this position, we can't avoid seriously engaging and working to alleviate the concerns of the 99%. And I realize this is no small task, and it requires systemic change, structural change, which is difficult, to say the least. It doesn't require simply voting for Democrat or Republican. It doesn't require simply doing charitable acts, but it requires something much, much larger and deeper. And I think that the hope that we can get from Benjamin and Adorno is that if we can see the world from a redeemed perspective, then at least we can keep on trotting along together in hopes of making that happen. And not only that, but as religious persons, as Christians, we also have, I think, a certain model for this. So there was a first century Jew who himself was rather a revolutionary, rather on the outskirts of politics, and he advocated for this type of systemic change. As Jörg pointed out, to say that Christ is the king is to say that Caesar is not. To give to God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's might actually mean that you don't give anything to Caesar at all. And I think that as we come together as a religious community, one of the most meaningful practices that we have as Christians would be the Eucharist, in which we break bread and pour out wine, if you're a Methodist, perhaps some grape juice. And we remember brokenness. Christ said to do this in remembrance of me. And by doing that, we are, in fact, affecting what Benjamin described as redemption by remembering suffering remembering one who died by the hands of an empire. I wouldn't shy away from preaching, and I, in fact, am in a church where some sermons have been preached on economic injustice that have encouraged folks to consider how they seek to embody an altered reality in their daily lives. So, doing things such as committing to, at least occasionally at the beginning, if you can, and maybe then more often later on, buying products from stores in which you know the name of the owner, in which you know that the shirt that you buy wasn't made in a sweatshop in a third world country, but was made down the street by people who are earning a living wage. Um, I think also simply coming together as a community to not only share the Eucharist, but to share a meal um, can be a very powerful act in a day and age where most of us go to brunch after church. And if you happen to be a member of my church, um, you go to brunch and have a lot of drinks after church. But um, but instead of focusing on visiting the latest restaurant in your neighborhood, uh, gathering together for a simple meal and enjoying each other's company and thinking and continuing to discuss these issues is a very powerful thing.